This revenge was never mine, and I need you to understand that before anything else, because if it had been mine, I probably would have let it go. I had spent enough years making peace with being invisible in my own family, that one more celebration in my brother's honor would have barely registered, but it was not mine. It belonged to my father, and my father died 14 months ago without ever finishing what he had started, and I found the file 3 weeks after the party where my entire family stood in my mother's living room and toasted my brother Daniel's promotion to regional director at Hargrove Solutions, without a single person in that room acknowledging that I was the one who had hired him 5 years ago, and that the company they were celebrating was mine, and that the promotion they were cheering had come from a performance review I had personally signed. And I stood there with a glass of wine, and I smiled, and I said, "Congratulations, Daniel." And then I went home, and I sat in my car in my own driveway, and I called my father's name out loud to no one, and I said, "I found it, Dad, and I'm going to finish it. My name is Claire Hargrove, and I am 39 years old, and I founded Hargrove Solutions when I was 27, with a business loan I took out myself and a client list I built from scratch. And by the time I was 34, the company had 42 employees and regional offices in 3 states. And I had hired my brother Daniel at 31 because he had asked, and because my mother had called and said, "Claire, your brother just needs a chance." And because I was a person who believed in chances, and Daniel was not incompetent. He was actually good at his job once he had structure. And I gave him structure, and I gave him mentorship, and I gave him a title that matched what he was capable of growing into. And over 5 years, he grew into it. And I was genuinely proud of that. And the promotion to regional director was earned and deserved, and I do not dispute any of that. What I dispute is that my family celebrated his career as though it had materialized from his own ambition, alone, and not from a decision I made to hire him when no one else would, and not from 5 years of my company's resources and my leadership, and I dispute it because it was not the first time, and it was not even the 10th time, and it was a pattern that had started long before I founded anything, and my father had known it, and my father had tried to address it, and then he got sick and ran out of time. My father's name was Gerald Hargrove, and he was a quiet man who watched things carefully and said less than he noticed, and he had built a small accounting practice over 30 years that he sold when he retired, and he had 2 children, which were me and Daniel, and he had loved us both. But he had seen us clearly, which was something my mother had never quite managed, and what my father had seen clearly was that my mother had spent my entire childhood directing her attention and her praise, and her investment toward Daniel in ways that were so consistent they could not have been accidental. And my father had told me this once when I was 23, and we were sitting on his porch, and he said, "Claire, your mother loves you. I want you to be clear on that, but she has a blind spot about Daniel, and I need you to know that I see what you do." And I said, "Okay, Dad." And he said, "I mean it. I see all of it." And I said, "I know." And we didn't talk about it again for a long time, because my father was not a man who repeated himself. He just meant things once and trusted you to hold them. What I found 3 weeks after the party was a manila folder in the box of my father's personal papers that my mother had given me when she was clearing his office, and the folder was labeled simply with my name in his handwriting, and inside it was a letter addressed to my mother that had never been sent, and a document that was 11 pages long, and the letter said, "Margaret, I have been trying to find the right way to say this for years, and I am running out of time. So I am going to write it instead," and the letter went through every specific instance my father had documented over 40 years of my mother, centering Daniel and sidelining me. And it was not emotional, it was precise. It had dates, it had quotes, it had specific family, events with specific details, and I sat on my kitchen floor and I read it, and I recognized every single item on the list, because I had been there for all of them, and seeing them written in my father's careful handwriting after he was gone was one of the most destabilizing experiences of my life, because it meant he had been watching and recording and building something, and then he had run out of time to send it. The 11-page document was different from the letter. It was not addressed to anyone. It was more like notes, and it outlined what my father had intended to do, which was sit my mother down with the letter and the documentation and ask her directly to reckon with the pattern, and he had been planning to do it at Thanksgiving 2 years ago. And then his diagnosis came in October, and Thanksgiving became something else entirely. And he never sent the letter, and he never had the conversation, and he died in February and left me a folder with my name on it. And 14 months later, my family threw a party for my brother's promotion in a company I built, and not one person said my name. and I sat on my kitchen floor with my father's letter. And I understood that he had left this for me not by accident and not without intention, and I made a decision that I believe he would have respected, which was that I was going to finish what he started. I did not send the letter because it was not mine to send, it was his, and I would not put my father's private words into a family conversation as a weapon that felt wrong, and it would have felt wrong to him too. So I did something different, which was that I wrote my own letter and I used nothing from his except the understanding that this required specificity and not emotion. And my letter to my mother was 4 pages, and it was calm, and it went through the party, and it went through the 5 years of Daniel's employment, and it went through specific family moments over the past decade where my work and my achievements had been mentioned briefly, or not at all, while Daniel's smaller wins received dinners and phone trees and group texts. And I did not say she loved him more. I said the pattern of attention and acknowledgement had been consistently unequal, and that I needed her to know I had noticed, and that I needed her to know my father had noticed too. And that was the only reference I made to his folder, and I sent the letter on a Sunday morning, and I did not call to follow up, I just waited. My mother called me on Wednesday, and she was crying, and she said, "Claire, I didn't know you felt this way." And I said, "Mom, this isn't about feelings, it's about a pattern." And she said, "I love you both equally." And I said, "I believe that, and I also believe that love and attention are not the same thing." And she was quiet. And then she said, "Your father talked to you about this." And I said, "He left me something?" "Yes." And she said, "What did he leave you?" And I said, "He left me enough to know I wasn't imagining it." And she cried for a while, and I let her, and then she said, "What do you need from me?" And that was the first time in my life my mother had asked me that question. And I said, "I need you to say my name at the next family gathering when someone asks about Daniel's career. I need you to say that his sister built the company he works for, and that she hired him, and that she is the reason he had the chance." And my mother said, "I can do that." And she did. Because 2 weeks later at my aunt's birthday dinner, someone asked Daniel about his promotion, and my mother said Daniel works for his sister Claire's company, and Claire gave him his start there. And Daniel looked at me across the table, and I looked back, and I did not smile, and I did not smirk. I just held his eyes for a moment, and then I picked up my fork, and I had dinner. And somewhere in that moment, I felt something settle that had been unsettled for a very long time. And I thought about my father, and I thought he would have called. That enough, and I think he would have been right. What my father started was not revenge, it was a request for honesty. And what I finished was the same thing. And I think sometimes the people who love us most see our lives more clearly than we can, and they want to correct things, and they run out of time. And if they leave us the right pieces, we can carry that correction forward, and it does not have to be loud. It does not have to be devastating. It just has to be true. And my mother saying my name at that dinner table was the smallest possible thing, and it was also the thing my father had been trying to make happen for 40 years, and I finished it for him 14 months after we lost him. And that is not revenge, that is just a daughter completing her father's last unfinished sentence.